Right, thanks very much to the Marcuse Society, to Mayor, and to Eduardo, also to Bruno. And so I'm going to be talking about Ukraine and Gaza today. Um, so in 1972, Herbert Marcuse rationalized his controversial World War II era work in the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA, with explicit reference to his anti-fascist principles and implicit reference to the undeniable atrocities then being committed by the Nazis toward European Jews. After the war, he worked at the US State Department but left for academia by the early 1950s. In the late 1960s and 70s, Marcuse resisted the genocidal Vietnam War being waged by the US government as professor, public intellectual, and so-called guru of the New Left. Like his erstwhile colleague and fellow critical theorist Theodore W. Adorno, who likewise opposed the Vietnam War but ironically passed away largely due to stress incurred by student protesters, students who protested against him in 1969. Marcuse directed much of his scholarly passion and attention to the cause of genocide prevention. Indeed, in Negative Dialectics, Adorno writes, quote, that a new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler upon unfree humanity to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen, end quote. Likewise, in one of his final lectures, Marcuse defines, quote, the goal of radical change today as being the emergence of human beings who are physically and mentally incapable of inventing another Auschwitz, end quote. Along these lines, this presentation will explore the seemingly disparate reactions among Western critical theorists to two present-day genocidal wars, namely the Russo-Ukrainian War and the Israel-Gaza War. When analyzing these conflicts from the standpoint of human rights and international humanitarian law, there can be little doubt of the genocidal intentions and actions of both Russia and Israel. After all, the International Criminal Court, or ICC, has authorized arrest warrants for the military and civilian leaders of Russia and Israel over war crimes they have committed in Ukraine and Gaza, respectively. Both conflicts are therefore similar to the Holocaust in the Adornian sense. To its credit, the Western left has essentially consensus on 2 points, that A, Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and that B, Israel's genocide in Gaza must be resisted and halted by all lawful means. Student protesters have courageously organized resistance to Israel's war on US campuses while suffering considerable retaliation from academic administrators and state authorities, the Trump regime second to none. Still, when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine, the Western left has been much more confused, demoralized, and divided, with opposition to the idea of supporting armed Ukrainian self-defense being especially prevalent. After evaluating the responses of contemporary Western leftists and critical theorists to ongoing wars in Ukraine and Palestine during the last 3 years, this presentation will discuss the grave realities at stake and briefly review the evidence for genocide in both cases, before proposing some possible explanations for the evidently discriminatory reactions among leftists to these atrocious current events. By highlighting the apparent contradiction between this lapse and critical theory's emphasis on genocide prevention, the argument will urge a profound rejection of orthodox leftist memory politics and pseudo-anti-imperialism, while presenting truth, international justice, and self-critique as remedial alternatives. To begin then, the Marcusean thinker Charles Wrights, in whose stream I am presenting my comments today, opens Herbert Marcuse as social justice educator by declaring, quote, the genocide and ecocide in Gaza to be the most compelling and disturbing issue concerning contemporary society and history today, end quote. In this sense, the widespread student protests that have raged against US support for Israel's atrocities in Gaza represent, quote, political eros, end quote, and, again, quote, the latest in a series of waves of youthful enthusiasm advocating social justice in terms of preservation of life and peace around the world, end quote. Here, Charles cites George Katsiafikas and myself, among others. Thanks, Charles. In parallel, in the revolutionary ecological legacy of Herbert Marcuse, Wrights acknowledges the Russo-Ukrainian War's, quote, pronounced brutality against civilians, end quote, and total lack of legitimacy, while citing Russian war crimes in Kyiv and Mariupol. However, Charles also insists that, quote, Russia's war has not emerged from nothing, end quote, and he worries that a new McCarthyism may arise that, quote, will try to silence US anti-war dissent, end quote. He cites an April 2022 international statement signed by groups in Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere, including the International Marxist Humanist Organization, or IMHO, which unquestionably identifies, quote, U.S. imperialism as the main culprit, end quote, of this war. On the contrary, the main culprit is neo-Tsarist and neo-Stalinist Russian President Vladimir Putin, who in 2005 lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent independence of 15 republics, including, of course, Ukraine, as, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and a great tragedy, and a genuine tragedy, excuse me, end quote. He ahistorically considers Russians and Ukrainians to be one people. The record shows that Putin launched the Russo-Ukrainian War in early 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, after the Kremlin-backed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, otherwise known as located in the region known as the Donbass, declared independence from Ukraine. Russia's first assault amounted to a revanchist attack on the popular and self-organized ouster of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, known as Euromaidan, in 2013-2014. Putin infamously escalated his war on Ukraine to a full-scale invasion in February 2022 under the cover of blackmailing the world with nuclear weapons should anyone interfere or stand in his way. In October 2025, the Slovenian leftist philosopher Slavoj Žižek observed that, quote, the West's fate will be decided by the two major crises of our time, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. If the West wants to live up to its moral claims, it must recognize that Ukrainians are in a situation similar to that of the Palestinians, end quote. The same goes for the Western left, which must confront and overcome what journalist Bill Weinberg calls selective solidarity. For instance, the left's support is usually extended to Palestinians under US-Israeli attack, but less consistently to Ukrainians or, for that matter, Syrians under Russian attack. Although states are the principal responsible parties in terms of observing international humanitarian law, quote, the prohibition on genocide is absolute, end quote, as former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillay stresses. This means that the left could also involve itself, intervene or interfere, whatever Putin says, especially given that the United States has so radically failed to observe its obligations to stop the commission of genocide, in light of Israel and Russia's ghastly wars on Gaza and Ukraine, respectively. While he is certainly no leftist or critical theorist, British Field Marshal Lord Richards provides insight into the importance of values and interests in influencing political and military alliances. Richards explains the decade-plus duration of the Russo-Ukrainian War as reflecting the fact that Ukraine is not, quote, an existential interest, end quote, for the US and most European governments. In much the same way, the Western left sidelines Ukraine due to the mistaken notion that the country's fate at the hands of Russia, its interest, is irrelevant to the fate of the left and humanity writ broadly. In other words, in parallel to the official Western denial of the reality of the Gaza genocide, yet by contrast with the progressive left-wing humanization of Palestinians, there is a breakdown over Ukraine of the wobbly slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all, as well as a loss of solidarity with shared values of anti-authoritarian resistance to neocolonial warfare, genocide, and ecocide. In a March 2025 interview, Rainer Funk, German president of the Erich Fromm Society, mused that Ukrainian self-defense to Russian aggression could escalate the war and lead to a downward spiral of violence. Why does he not charge Putin's full-scale invasion with the same? Well, that might just raise the question of blame, which Funk believes, quote, would have to be set aside, end quote, in the interests of peace. In parallel, the renowned anarchist linguist Noam Chomsky compared the Russian invasion of 2022 to a hurricane, quote unquote, urging Ukraine to surrender. Meanwhile, the new Routledge volume, The Marcusean Mind, despite amounting to over 500 pages, mentions Ukraine on just 4 pages, and Palestine and the Palestinians on 7. While she expresses pro-Palestinian sympathies, the British member of Parliament Zara Sultana, formerly of the Labour Party and now co-founder with Jeremy Corbyn of your party, recently suggested that the UK should altogether halt arms sales to Ukraine. And though the neo-Stalinist journal Monthly Review cannot be said to be advancing critical theory, Its present editor-in-chief, the well-known eco-Marxist John Bellamy Foster, is known to engage in uncritical apologism for Russia's war on Ukraine. Krasmat, the Russian Confederation of Revolutionary Anarcho-Syndicalists, which is an affiliate of the International Workers' Association, or IWA, distorts Russia's attack on Ukraine into a, quote, clash between the ruling elites of both countries, end quote, according to writer Nikita Ivansky, while illogically denouncing those like myself who signed a November 2025 petition against the silencing of Eastern European voices at anarchist book fairs in the European Union as ostensible supporters of quote-unquote capitalist war. Similarly, the Serbian Anarcho-Syndicalist Initiative, another IWA affiliate, echoed Putin's propaganda at the start of the full-scale invasion by unreasonably labeling Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a Nazi. Were he alive today, Rudolf Rocker, founder of the IWA and an outspoken critic of Stalinism, would likely be unsettled to hear of this. That being said, the Spanish Confederación General de Trabajo presents a principled anti-militarist position, which focuses on the unjust suffering of the Ukrainian working class at the hands of the Russian military and the Ukrainian state itself. Concretely, it criticizes the Spanish government for supplying military aid to Zelensky and calls for desertion from armies on both sides. Feminist Elisa Moros explains that a reflexive opposition to the socialist government's support for Zelensky is common among institutionalized radical leftists in Spain, such as members of Podemos and the Catalan left, leading to the paradoxical affirmation that, quote, Ukrainians themselves matter little to us, end quote. In fact, just 2 days ago, a squatted social center in Madrid canceled a day-long public event for Solidarity Collectives, a Ukrainian anarchist humanitarian group. By contrast, to their credit, the IMHO and the New Politics editors are generally consistent in supporting Palestinian and Ukrainian self-determination and resistance against their neo-colonial oppressors. Indeed, New Politics promotes the Ukrainian socialist journal Commons and calls for arms for Ukraine, whereas IMHO is part of the Ukraine Solidarity Network. The US-based Black Rose Rosa Negra Anarchist Federation, which supports protests against Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, has no mention of the Russo-Ukrainian war on its website, and it takes no official position on Russia's invasion. Some of its constituents, whom I interviewed in June 2025, interpret the conflict as a quote-unquote inter-imperialist war and or the result of US NATO meddling in Eastern Europe. Perhaps my fellow anarchists' position has something to do with a lack of information. For only 1 out of 20 anarchist book fairs held in the US since early 2022, that is to say 5%, has included at least one public event on Ukraine. Certainly, several Ukrainian and international anarchists have died fighting the Russians over the past nearly 4 years. Martyrs like the Ukrainian David Chichkan, the Russian Dmitry Petrov, the Irishman Finbar Kaferki, and the African-American Cooper Andrews, among others. Ukrainian anarchists and socialists continue to fight against the Russian invaders from within and outside the ranks of the armed forces. Notably, the Russian military is now threatening the city of Huliapol in Zaporizhia, birthplace of the well-known Ukrainian anarchist Nestor Makhno. Now to talk about the stakes. The stakes involved in these two wars could not be higher. In July of this year, in his essay, The Destruction of Palestine is Breaking the World, journalist Mustafa Bayoumi decries the utter brutality of the Gaza genocide as a blatant attack on international law. He suggests that Israel's endless massacres in Gaza may be meant to desensitize the US public to mass atrocities, thus preparing the citizenry for a future war with China, which would certainly involve very heavy casualties on both sides. A similar dynamic may govern the Trump regime's ruthless killings at sea of South American laborers and fishermen, demonized as narco-terrorists, quote-unquote, over the past 3 months, as the administration attempts to normalize war crimes ahead of a potentially devastating near-term attack on Venezuela. Just last month, Professor Una Hathaway warned that the basis of the post-World War II global order, as enshrined in the ban on acquiring territory by force, is under dire threat due to ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine. In parallel, Wrights asks, quote, will today's Ukraine war go nuclear? As long as the Russo-Ukrainian war drags on, the risk that Charles identifies will surely be ever present. Indeed, the risks of nuclear war arguably increase the longer the war drags on, especially considering the direct involvement now of North Korea on Russia's side, taken together with China's secretive arms purchases from Russia ahead of a possible invasion of Taiwan, and the Trump and Putin regime's latest threats to irrationally and reciprocally resume nuclear weapons testing. Russia's aggressive nuclear posture may follow the escalate to de-escalate strategy, despite the fact that any such resumption of nuclear testing by the US and Russia would pose immense short-term and medium-term threats to humanity, both from radioactive fallout and by lowering the threshold to nuclear war. In this sense, Russia's unprecedented drone incursions into Poland in September of this year, followed by its buzzing of MiGs in Estonia, and its orchestration of railway sabotage in Poland last month to interrupt supplies to Ukraine, have led the Polish state to effectively consider itself to be preparing for a Russian invasion. In June of this year, historian Fiona Hill observed that Russia is in essence at war with the UK, and developments from recent weeks, including the appearance of a Russian corvette and spy ship in UK waters, only confirm her ominous insight. In parallel, Zelensky may be right to warn that Putin is preparing to attack another European country in an attempt to test the Trump regime's level of commitment to NATO's Article 5, which mandates the activation of collective defense in the face of aggression. As with Gaza, where a ceasefire has more or less held for 2 months, the Trump regime is desperate to impose terms on Kyiv that amount to capitulation. 10 days ago, Bloomberg News revealed that Trump's chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, a real estate investor with no apparent diplomatic experience, secretly offered Putin's representative all of the Ukrainian oblast of Donetsk, including key territories and defensive positions not yet occupied by the Russian army, as part of a potential peace settlement. In fact, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio divulged that the 28-point plan that Witkoff presented last month to the Ukrainian government as the basis of an end to the war, stipulating that Ukraine recognize Russia's annexation of the territories it has conquered, including Crimea, while lifting sanctions against Russia and granting it amnesty for war crimes, actually came from the Kremlin itself. Even as some congressional Republicans have broken with Trump and called for Witkoff's ouster as the scandal has developed, he and fellow financier Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, traveled last week to Moscow to negotiate terms. The Ukrainian Nobel Peace Prize winner Alexandra Mavichuk aptly observes that Witkoff's proposal merely rewards Russia for its genocidal aggression, while normalizing conquest, encouraging other authoritarian leaders to attack their neighbors, and abandoning an estimated 3 million Ukrainians living under Russian occupation to their fate. I'm going to skip ahead. In Gaza, Trump has imposed terms of a ceasefire that both Russia and Hamas agreed to, and which the UN Security Council has endorsed. Even so, these same conditions allow Israel's genocide of Palestinians to persist, as Amnesty International explains. Specifically, the terms concentrate Palestinians into a coastal red zone where no reconstruction will be allowed to take place. This red zone is cut off from Gaza's agricultural fields, most of them admittedly wrecked by war, that are located within the so-called green zone. While this agreement is not the completely sociopathic Gaza Riviera plan that Trump outlined in a February 2025 press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, based on previous input from Kushner, it is nonetheless thoroughly neo-colonial and genocidal. The left is correct to criticize it, while calling Israel and the US to account for their war crimes and proposing fairer terms for peace and justice. Now to conclude, although I have been referring to genocide in the case of both wars on Gaza and Ukraine in my comments, I have not necessarily defined the basis for such a legal determination in either case. Briefly, in Gaza, one could point to the estimated 100 to 200,000 Palestinians killed by Israel over the course of the 2 years of war, vast majority of them being civilians, including tens of thousands of children, and to Israel's widespread destruction of medical and residential infrastructure. In Ukraine, Russia's genocide is seen in its abduction, forcible adoption, and deportation of Ukrainian children as far as North Korea, together with its intentional targeting of civilians, as well, which includes so-called human safaris in Kherson, and targeting of non-military infrastructure, particularly energy facilities during winter. Such is the reality of the situation, regardless of what overt supporters of Israel or Russia might say. Accordingly, in the interest of truth and international justice, and in the spirit of self-critique, leftists and critical theorists should confront their pseudo-anti-imperialist tendencies. That is, as Rohini Hensman describes, those tendencies that align with the interests of the ruling classes of non-Western imperialist powers like Russia and China through efforts to oppose Western imperialism. The shameful response of most Western leftists to the Syrian revolution against the former Assad regime from 2011 to 2024 typified this toxic phenomenon, while the inconsistent solidarity provided by many leftists in the face of Russia's genocidal war on Ukraine shows that it unfortunately persists. To its credit, though, as we've described, the left has rightly condemned the US and Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. In closing, to return to Lord Richard's insight about values and interests, it bears emphasizing that the left and critical theorists share values and interests with both Palestinians and Ukrainians. As I've explained in my comments today, though, there is an unfortunate kind of denial about this reality on much of the left vis-a-vis Ukraine. Hence, more education and even perhaps a new sensibility are needed to overcome this contradiction and to extend the left's embrace of Palestinians to Ukrainians. In this vein, finally, I wish to mention a few inspiring examples of international solidarity, namely the March 2022 protests carried out by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Chiapas, Mexico, to demand the withdrawal of the Russian army from Ukraine, the August 2025 protest held in Kyiv by Ukrainian leftists in solidarity with Gaza outside the Holodomor Museum, the anti-imperialist tent set up at the System Change Camp 2025 in Frankfurt, the publication on comments of the Ukrainian letter of solidarity with Palestinian people in November 2023, and the Welsh miners' unions who have been taking direct action to support and supply their fellow unionized miners in Ukraine. May these examples light the way to a better future. Thank you.